by its unmeaning shadows the symmetry of that calm face. No vestigial ears project. The mouth is a small, perfectly round aperture, toothless and gumless, joyless, unanimal, no futile emotion disturbing its roundness as it lies like the harvest moon or the evening star in the wide firmament of face. Such is the face the professor beholds in the future. Of course, parallel modifications will also affect the body and limbs. Every day, so many hours and so much energy are required for digestion. A gross torpidity, a carnal lethargy seizes on mortal men after dinner. This may and can be avoided. Men's knowledge of organic chemistry widens daily. Already, he can supplement to the gastric glands by artificial devices. Every doctor who administers physic implies that the bodily functions may be artificially superseded. We have pepsine, pancreatine, artificial gastric acid, I know not what like mixtures. Why then should not the stomach be ultimately superannuated altogether? A man who could not only leave his dinner to be cooked, but also leave it to be masticated and digested, would have vast social advantages over his food-digesting fellow. This is, let me remind you here, the calmest, most passionless and scientific working out of the future forms of things from the data of the present. At this stage, the following facts may perhaps stimulate your imagination. There can be no doubt that many of the arthropods, a division of animals more ancient and even now more prevalent than the vertebrata, have undergone more phylogenetic modification, a beautiful phrase, than even the most modified of vertebrated animals. Simple forms like the lobster display a primitive structure parallel with that of the fishes. However, in such a form as the degraded Chondracanthus, the structure has diverged far more widely from its original type than in man. Among some of these most highly modified crustaceans, the whole of the alimentary canal, that is, all the food-digesting and food-absorbing parts, form a useless solid cord. The animal is nourished. It is a parasite by absorption of the nutritive fluid in which it swims. Is there any absolute impossibility in supposing man to be destined for a similar change? To imagine him no longer dining, but unwieldy paraphernalia of servants and plates upon food queerly dyed and distorted, but nourishing himself in elegant simplicity by immersion in a tub of nutritive fluid. There grows upon the impatient imagination a building, a dome of crystal across the translucent surface of which flushes of the most glorious and pure prismatic colors pass and fade and change. In the center of this transparent chameleon-tinted dome is a circular white marble basin filled with some clear mobile amber liquid, and in this plunge and float strange beings. Are they birds? They are the descendants of men at dinner. Watch them as they hop on their hands, a method of progression advocated already by Jonan about the pure white marble floor. Great hands they have, enormous brains, soft, liquid, soulful eyes, the whole muscular system, the legs, the abdomen.
Further visions of the professor are less alluring.
The animals and plants die away before men, except such as our delight, or such as maintains a precarious footing about him as commensals and parasites. These vermin and pests must succumb sooner or later to his untiring inventiveness and incessantly growing discipline. when he learns. The chemists are doubtless getting towards the secret now to do the work of the chlorophyll. Without the plant, then his necessity for other animals and plants upon the earth will disappear. Sooner or later, where there is no power of resistance and no necessity, there comes extinction. In the last days, man will be alone on the earth, and his food will be won by the chemist from the dead rocks and the sunlight. And one may learn the full reason in that explicit and painfully right book, The Data of Ethics. The irrational fellowship of men will give place to an intellectual cooperation, and emotion fall within the scheme of reason. Undoubtedly, it is a long time yet, but a long time is nothing in the face of eternity. And every man who dares think of these things must look eternity in the face.
Then the Earth is ever radiating away heat into space, the professor reminds us. And so at last comes a vision of earthly cherubim, hopping heads, great unemotional intelligences, and little hearts fighting together perforce and fiercely against the cold that grips them tighter and tighter. For the world is cooling, slowly and inevitably it grows colder as the years roll by.
We must imagine these creatures, says the professor, in galleries and laboratories deep down in the bowels of the earth. The whole world will be snow-covered and piled with ice. All animals, all vegetation vanished, except this last branch of the tree of life. The last man may have gone even deeper, following the diminishing heat of the planet, and vast metallic shafts and ventilators make way for the air they need.
So, with a glimpse of these human tadpoles in their deep, close gallery, with their boring machinery ringing away and artificial lights glaring and casting black shadows, the professor's horoscope concludes. Humanity in dismal retreat before the cold, changed beyond recognition. Yet the professor is reasonable enough. His facts are current science, his methods orderly. The contemplative man shivers at the prospect, starts up to poke the fire, and the whole of this remarkable book that is not written vanishes straight away in the smoke of his pipe. This is the great advantage of this unwritten literature. There is no bother in changing the books. The contemplative man consoles himself for the destiny of the species with the lost portion of Kubla Khan. The Extinction of Man. It is part of the excessive egotism of the human animal that the bare idea of its extinction seems incredible to it. A world without us, it says, as a heady young Cephalaspis might have said it in the old Silurian Sea. But since the Cephalapsis and the Cocotus, many a fine animal has increased and multiplied upon the earth, lorded it over land or sea without a rival, and passed at last into the night. Surely it is not so unreasonable to ask why man should be an exception to the rule. From the scientific standpoint, at least, any reason for such exception is hard to find. No doubt, man is undisputed master at the present time, at least of most of the land's surface. But so it has been before with other animals. Let us Consider what light geology has thrown upon this. The great land and sea reptiles of the Mesozoic period, for instance, seem to have been as secure as humanity is now in their preeminence. But they passed away and left no descendants when the new orders of the mammals emerged from their obscurity. So, too, the huge Titanothria of the American continent and the all-powerful Pleistocene South America, the saber-toothed lion, for instance, and Maracina suddenly came to a finish when they were still almost at the zenith of their rule. And in no case does the record of the fossils show a really dominant species succeeded by its own descendants. What has usually happened in the past appears to be the emergence of some type of animal hitherto rare and unimportant, and the extinction not simply of the previously ruling species, but of most of the forms that are at all closely related to it. Sometimes, indeed, as in the case of the extinct giants of South America, they vanished without any considerable rivals, victims of pestilence, famine, or, it may be, of that cumulative inefficiency that comes of a too undisputed life. So that the analogy of geology at any rate is against this too acceptable view of man's certain tenure of the earth for the next few million years or so. And, after all, even now, man is by no means such a master of the kingdoms of life as he is apt to imagine. The sea, that mysterious nursery of living things, is for all practical purposes beyond his control. The low water mark is his limit. Beyond that he may do a little with seine and dredge, murder a few million herrings a year as they come into spawn, butcher his fellow air-breather, the whale, or haul now and then an unlucky king crab or strange sea urchin out of the deep water, in the name of science. But the life of the sea as a whole knows him not, plays out its slow drama of change and development unheeding him, and may, in the end, in mere idle sport, throw up some new terrestrial denizens, some new competitor for space to live in and food to live upon, that will sweep him and all his little contrivances out of existence, as certainly and inevitably as he has swept away auk, bison, and dodo during the last 200 years. For instance, there are crustacea. As a group, the crabs and lobsters are confined below the high water mark. But experiments in air breathing are no doubt in progress in this group. We already have tropical land crabs, and as far as we know, there is no reason why in the future these creatures should not increase in size and terrestrial capacity. In the past, we have the evidence of the fossil paradoxids, that creatures of this kind may at least attain a length of 6 feet, and considering their intense pugnacity, a crab of such dimensions would be as formidable a creature as one could well imagine. And their amphibious capacity would give them an advantage against us, such as at present is only to be found in the case of the alligator or crocodile. If we imagine a shark that could raid out upon the land, or a tiger that could take refuge in the sea, we should have a fair suggestion of what a terrible monster a large predatory crab might prove. And so far as zoological science goes, we must at least admit that such a creature is an evolutionary possibility. Then again, the order of the cephalopods, to which belong the cuttlefish and the octopus, sacred to Victor Hugo, may be, for all we can say, to the contrary, an order with a future. The kindred the gastropods have, in the case of the snail, and slug learnt the trick of air breathing. And not improbably there are even now genera of this order that have escaped the naturalist, or even well-known genera whose possibilities in growth and dietary are still unknown. Suppose someday a specimen of a new species is caught off the coast of Kent. It excites remark at a Royal Society soiree, engenders a science note or so, a huge octopus, and in the next year or so 3 or 4 other specimens come to hand, and the thing becomes familiar. Probably a new and larger variety of octopus, so-and-so, hitherto supposed to be tropical, says Professor Gargoyle, and thinks he has disposed of it. Then conceive some mysterious boating accidents and deaths while bathing. A large animal of this kind, coming into a region of frequent wrecks, might so easily acquire a preferential taste for human nutriment, just as the Colorado beetle acquired a new taste for the common potato and gave up its old food plant some years ago. Then perhaps a school or pack or flock of octopus gigas would be found busy picking the sailors off a stranded ship, and then in the course of a few years it might begin to stroll up the beaches and batten on excursionists. Soon it would be a common feature of the watering places, possibly at last commoner than excursionists. Suppose such a creature were to appear, and it is, we repeat, a possibility, if perhaps a remote one, how could it be fought against? Something might be done by torpedoes, but so far as our past knowledge goes, man has no means of seriously diminishing the numbers of any animal of the most rudimentary intelligence that made its fastness in the sea. Even on land it is possible to find creatures that, with a little modification, might become excessively dangerous to the human ascendancy. Most people have read of the migratory ants of Central Africa, against which no man can stand. On the march they simply clear out whole villages, drive men and animals before them in headlong rout, and kill and eat every living creature they can capture. One wonders why they have not already spread the area of their devastations. But at present, no doubt, they have their natural checks of ant-eating birds or what not. In the near future, it may be that the European immigrant, as he sets the balance of life swinging in his vigorous manner, may kill off these ant-eating animals, or otherwise unwittingly remove the checks that now keep these terrible little pests within limits. And once they begin to spread in real earnest, it is hard to see how their advance could be stopped. A world devoured by ants seems incredible now, simply because it is not within our experience. But a naturalist would have a dull imagination who could not see in the numerous species of ants and in their already high intelligence far more possibility of strange developments than we have in the solitary human animal. And no doubt the idea of the small and feeble organism of man, triumphant and omnipresent, would have seemed equally incredible to an intelligent mammoth or Paleolithic cave bear. And finally, there is always the prospect of a new disease. As yet, science has scarcely touched more than the fringe of the probabilities associated with the minute fungi that constitute our zymotic diseases. But the bacilli have no more settled down in their final quiescence than have men. Like ourselves, they are adapting themselves to new conditions and acquiring new powers. The plagues of the Middle Ages, for instance, seem to have been begotten of a strange bacillus engendered under conditions that sanitary science, in spite of its panacea of drainage, still admits are imperfectly understood. And for all we know, even now, we may be quite unwittingly evolving some new and more terrible plague, a plague that will not take 10 or 20 or 30%, as plagues have done in the past, but the entire 100. No, man's complacent assumption of the future is too confident. We think, because things have been easy for mankind as a whole for a generation or so, we are going on to perfect comfort and security in the future. We think that we shall always go to work at 10 and leave off at 4, and have dinner at 7 for ever and ever. But these 4 suggestions, out of a host of others, must surely do a little against this complacency. Even now, for all we can tell, the coming terror may be crouching for its spring, and the fall of humanity be at hand. In the case of every other predominant animal the world has ever seen, I repeat, the hour of its complete ascendancy has been the eve of its entire overthrow. But if some poor story-writing man ventures to figure this sober probability in a tale, not a reviewer in London but will tell him his theme is the utterly impossible. And when the thing happens, one may doubt if even then one will get the recognition one deserves. The writing of essays. The art of the essayist is so simple, so entirely free from canons of criticism, and withal so delightful, that one must needs wonder why all men are not essayists. Perhaps people do not know how easy it is, or perhaps beginners are misled. Rightly taught, it may be learnt in a brief 10 minutes or so what art there is in it. And all the rest is as easy as wandering among woodlands on a bright morning in the spring. Then sit down, if you would join us, taking paper, pens, and ink, and mark this. Your pen is a matter of vital moment, for every pen writes its own sort of essay, and pencils also, after their kind. The ink, perhaps, may have its influence too, and the paper, but paramount is the pen. This, indeed, is the fundamental secret of essay writing. Wed any man to his proper pen, and the delights of composition and the birth of an essay are assured. Only many of us wander through the earth and never meet with her, futile and lonely men. And of all pens, your quill for essays that are for literature. There is a subtle informality, a delightful easiness, perhaps even a faint immorality essentially literary, about the quill. The quill is rich in suggestion and quotation. There are quills that would quote you Montaigne and Horace in the hands of a trades union delegate, and those quirky idle noises this pen makes are delightful and would break your easy fluency with wit. All the classical essayists wrote with a quill, and Addison used the most expensive kind the government purchased, and the beginning of the inferior essay was the dawn of the cheap steel pen. The quill nibs they sell to fit into ordinary pen holders are no true quills at all, lacking dignity, and may even lead you into the new humour if you trust overmuch to their use. After a proper quill, commend me to a stumpy BB pencil. You get less polish and broader effects, but you are still doing good literature. Sometimes the work is close. Mr. George Meredith, for instance, is suspected of a soft pencil, and always it is blunter than quill work and more terse. With a hard pencil, no man can write anything but a graceless style, a kind of east wind air it gives, and smile you cannot, so that it is often used for serious articles in the half-crown reviews. There follows the host of steel pens, that bald, clear, scientific style, all set about with words like evolution and environment, which aims at expressing its meaning with precision, and an exemplary economy of words is done with fine steel nibs, 12 a penny at any stationer's. The J-pen to the lady novelist, and the stylograph to the devil. Your essayist must not touch the things. So much for the pen. If you cannot write essays easily, that is where the hitch comes in. Get a box of a different kind of pen and begin again, and so on again and again, until despair or joy arrests you. As for a typewriter, you could no more get an essay out of a typewriter than you could play a sonata upon its keys. No essay was ever written with a typewriter yet, nor ever will be. Besides its impossibility, the suggestion implies a brutal disregard of the division of labour by which we live and move and have our being. If the essayist typewrite, the unemployed typewriter, who is commonly a person of superior education and capacity, might take to essays, and where is your living then? One might as reasonably start at once with the linotype and print one's wit and humour straight away. And taking the invasion of other trades one step further, one might, after an attempt to sell one's own newspaper, even get to the pitch of having to read it oneself. No, even essayists must be reasonable. If its mechanical clitter-clatter did not render composition impossible, the typewriter would still be beneath the honour of a literary man. Then for the paper. The luxurious, expensive, small-sized cream-laid note is best, and, failing that, ripped envelopes and the back of bills. Some men love ruled paper, because they can write or thwart the lines, and some take the fly-leaves of their friends' books. But whosoever writes on cheap sermon paper full of hairs should write far away from the woman he loves, lest he offends her ears. It is good, however, for a terse, forcible style. The ink should be glossy black as it leaves your pen, for polished English. Violet inks lead to sham sentiment, and blue-black to vulgarity. Red ink essays are often good, but usually unfit for publication. This is as much almost as anyone need to know to begin essay writing. Given your proper pen and ink, or pencil and paper, you simply sit down and write the thing. The value of an essay is not its matter, but its mood. You must be comfortable, of course, in an easy chair with armrests, slippers, and a book to write upon are usually employed, and you must be fed recently and your body clothed with ease rather than grandeur. For the rest, do not trouble to stick to your subject or any subject, and take no thought for the editor or the reader, for your essay should be as spontaneous as the lilies of the field. So long as you do not begin with a definition, you may begin anyhow. An abrupt beginning is much admired, after the fashion of the clown's entry through the chemist's window. Then whack at your reader at once. Hit him over the head with the sausages, brisk him up with the poker, bundle him into the wheelbarrow, and so carry him away with you before he knows where you are. You can do what you like with the reader then, if you only keep him nicely on the move. So long as you are happy, your reader will be so too. But one law must be observed. An essay, like a dog that wishes to please, must have a lively tale, short but as waggish as possible. Like a rocket, an essay goes only with fizzle and sparks at the end of it. And know that to stop writing is the secret of writing an essay. The essay that the public loves dies young. The Parks Museum. The place to spend a happy day. By way of jest, my morning daily paper constantly includes in its menu of today the Parks Museum, Margaret Street, adding seductively, free. And no doubt many a festive Jonas Chuzzlewit has preened himself for a sightseeing, and all unaware of the multitudes of Margaret Streets. Surely only Charlottes of that ilk are more abundant. Has started forth, he and his feminine, to find this Parks Museum. One may even conceive a rare bank holiday thoughtfully put aside for the quest, and spent all vainly in the asking of policemen and in traversing this vast and tiresome metropolis from Margaret Street to Margaret Street, the freshness of the morning passing into the dry heat of the day, fatigue spreading from the feet upwards, discussion, difference, denial, words, and a day of recreation dying at last into a sunset of lurid sulks. Such possibility was too painful to think of, and a philanthropic inquirer has, at least by persistent investigation, won the secret of the missing museum and opened the way to it for all future investigators. The Margaret Street in question is an apparently derelict thoroughfare opening into Great Portland Street. Immemorial dust is upon its pavements, and a profound silence broods over its vacant roadway. The blinds of its houses are mostly down, and where the blackness of some windows suggests a dark interior, no face appears to reassure us in our doubt of humanity within. It may be that somewhen in the past the entire population of this street set out on a boating party up the river, and was overset by steam launches, and so never returned. Or, perchance, it has all been locked up for a long term of imprisonment, though the houses seem almost too respectable for that. Or the glamour of the Sleeping Beauty is upon it all. Certainly we saw the figure of a porter in an attitude of repose in the little glass lodge in the museum doorway. He may have been asleep, but we feared to touch him, and indeed slipped very stealthily by him, lest he should suddenly crumble into dust. And so to the museum and its wonders. This Parks Museum is a kind of armoury of hygiene, a place full of apparatus for being healthy. In brief, a museum of sanitary science. To that large and growing class of people who take no thought of anything but what they eat and what they drink, and wherewithal they should be clothed, it should prove intensely interesting. Apart from the difficulty of approach, we cannot understand how it is so neglected by an intelligent public. You can see germicides and a model convict prison, Pentonville cells in miniature, statistical diagrams and drain pipes. If only there was a little more about hereditary, it would be exactly the kind of thing that is popular in literature now, as literature goes, and yet, excepting ourselves and the sleeping porter, if he was sleeping, and the indistinct and motionless outline visible through a glass door of a human body sitting over a book, there was not a suggestion or memory of living humanity about the place. The exhibits of food are especially remarkable. We cleaned the glass case with our sleeves and peered at the most appetizing revelations. There are dozens of little bottles hermetically sealed, containing such curios as a sample of bacon common, gammon uncooked, and then the same cooked, it looked no nicer cooked, Irish sausage, pork sausage, black pudding, Welsh mutton, and all kinds of rare and exquisite feeding. There are ever so many cases of this kind of thing. We saw, for instance, further along, several good specimens of the common oyster shell, Oystra edulis, cockle shells and whelks, both almonds and whites, and then came breadstuffs. The breadstuffs are particularly impressive, of a grey scientific aspect, a hard, hoary antiquity. We always knew that stale bread was good for one, but yet the Parks Museum startled us with the antique pattern it recommended. There was a muffin too, identified and labelled, but without any Latin name. A captured crumpet, a collection of buns, a dinner roll, and a something novel to us called pumpernickel that we had rather be without, or rather, for the expression is ambiguous, that we had rather not be without, but altogether remote from. And all these things have been tested by an analyst with the most painful results. Nitrogen, oxygen, hydrogen, and the like nasty chemical things seem indeed to have occurred in everything he touched. Those sturdy mendicants who go about complaining that they cannot get food should visit this Parks Museum and see what food is really like, and learn contentment with their lot. There were no real vegetables, but only the ideals of a ferrin of seedsman, made of wax and splendidly coloured with something of the boldness and vigour of Michelangelo about the modelling of them. And among other foodstuffs were sweetmeats and yellow capers, liver flukes, British wines, and snuff. At last we felt replete with foodstuffs, and went on to see the models to illustrate ventilation, and the exhibits of hygienic glazed tiles arranged around a desert lecture theatre. Hygienic tiles stimulate the eye vigorously rather than relax it by any aesthetic weaknesses, and the crematory appliances are so attractive as they are, and must have such an added charm of neatness and brightness when alight that one longs to lose a relative or so forthwith for the mere pleasure of seeing them in operation. A winding staircase, designed upon hygienic principles to bump your head at intervals, takes one to a little long iron gallery full of the most charming and varied display of cooking stoves and oil lamps. Here also there are flaunted the resources of civilization for the prevention of accidents, which resources are four, namely a patent fire escape, a patent carriage pole, a cold plate, and a dog muzzle. But the labels, though verbose, are scarcely full enough. They do not tell you, for instance, if you wish to prevent cramp while bathing, whether the dog muzzle or the cold plate should be employed, nor do they show how the fire escape will prevent the explosion of a paraffin lamp. However, this is a detail. We feel assured that no intelligent person will regret a visit to this most interesting and instructive exhibition. It offers you valuable hints how to live and suggests the best and tidiest way in which you can, when dead, dispose of your body. We feel assured that the public only needs this intimation of its whereabouts to startle the death-like slumbers of Margaret Street with an unaccustomed tumult, and the first to arrive will, no doubt, find legibly and elegantly written in the dust that covers the collection the record of its discovery by Euphemia and me. Bleak March in Epping Forest. All along the selvage of Epping Forest there was excitement. Before the swallows, before the violets, long before the cuckoo, with only untimely honeysuckle bushes showing a trace of green, two trippers had been seen traversing the district, making their way towards High Beach and settling a while near the Forest Hotel. Whether they were belated survivals from last season or exceptionally early hatchings of the coming year was a question of considerable moment to the natives, and has since engaged the attention of the local Natural History Society. But we know that, as a matter of fact, they were of little omen, being indeed but insignificant people from Hampstead, and not true trippers at all, who were curious to see this forest in raw winter. For some have argued that there is no Epping Forest at all in the winter-time, that it is, in fact, taken up and put away, and that agriculture is pursued there. Others assert that the forest is shrouded with wrappers, even as a literary man's study is shrouded by dusty women when they clean him out. Others, again, have supposed that it is a delightful place in winter, far more delightful than in the summer, but that it is not published because no writing man hath ever been there in the cold season, and much more of unreal speculation, but nothing which bore upon it the stamp of truth. So these two, and I am one of them, went down to Epping Forest to see that it was still there, and how it fared in the dismal winter. The sky was a greasy grey that guttered down to the horizon, and the wind smote damp and chill. There was a white fringe of ice in the cartwheel ruts, but with all the frost was not so crisp as to prevent a thin and slippery glaze of softened clay upon the road. The decaying triumphal arch outside the station sadly lacked a coat of paint and was indistinctly regretful of remote royal visits and processions gone for ever. Then we passed, shuddering by many vacant booths that had once resounded with the revelry of ninepenny teas and the ginger beer cork staccato, and their forms were piled together and their trestles overturned. And the wind ravened, and no human beings were to be seen. So up the hill to the left and along the road leading by devious windings between the black hedges and through clay wallows to the hilly part round High Beach. But upon the shoulder of a hill we turned to a gate to scrape off mud that made our boots unwieldy. At that moment came a threadbare place in the cloudy curtain that was sweeping across the sun, and our shadows showed themselves for an instant to comfort us. The amber patch of sunlight presently slipped from us and travelled down the meadows towards the distant blue of the hills by Waltham Abbey, touching with miraculous healing a landscape erst dead and shrouded in grey. This transitory gleam of light gladdened us mightily at the time, but it made the after sky seem all the darker. So through the steep and tortuous village to Highgate, and then, leaving the road, we wandered in among big trees and down slopes ankle deep with rustling leaves towards Chingford again. Here was pleasanter walking than the thawing clay, but now and then one felt the threat of an infinite oozy softness beneath the stiff frozen leaves. Once again, while we were here, the drifting haze of the sky became thinner, and the smooth green-grey beech stems and rugged oak trunks were brightly illuminated. But only for a moment, and thereafter the sky became not simply unsympathetic, but ominous, and the misery of the wind grew apace. Presently we wandered into that sinister corner of the forest, where the beech trees have grown so closely together that they have had perforce to lift their branches vertically. Divested of leaves, the bare grey limbs of these seem strangely restless. These trees, reaching so eagerly upward, have an odd resemblance to the weird figures of horror in which William Blake delighted. Arms, hands, hair, all stretch intensely to the zenith. They seem to be straining away from the spot to which they are rooted. It is a Laocoon grouping, a wordless concentrated struggle for the sunlight, and disagreeably impressive. The trippers longed to talk and were tongue-tied. They looked now and then over their shoulders. They were glad when the eerie influence was past, though they traversed a morass to get away from it. Then across an open place, dismal with the dun-hulls of lost cows and the clatter of their bells, over a brook full of dead leaves and edged with rusty clay, through a briary thicket that would fain have detained us, and so to a pathway of succulent green that oozed black under our feet. Here some poor lost wayfarer has blazed his way with rustic seats, now rheumatic and fungus-eaten. And here, too, the wind, which had sought us howling, found us at last, and stung us sharply with a shower of congealing raindrops. This grew to a steady downfall as the open towards Chingford station was approached at last, after devious winding in the forest. Then, coming upon the edge of the wood and seeing the lone station against the grey sky, we broke into a shout and began running. But it is dismal running on imperfectly frozen clay, in rain and a gusty wind. We slipped and floundered, and one of us wept sore that she should never see her home again. And worse, the only train sleeping in the station was awakened by our cries, and with an eldritch shriek at the unseasonable presence of trippers, fled incontinently Londonward. Smeared with clay and dead leaves, almost beyond human likeness, we staggered into the derelict station, and found from an outcast porter that perhaps another train might, after the lapse of 2 hours, accumulate sufficiently to take us back to Gospel Oak and a warm world again. So we speered if there were amusements to be got in this place, and he told us some very nice walks. To refrain from homicide, we left the station and sought a vast red hotel that loomed through the drift on a steep hill, and in the side of this a door that had not been locked. Happily, one had been forgotten, and entering at last, we roused a hibernating waiter, and he exhumed us some of his winter victual. In this way, we were presently, to some degree, comforted, and could play chess until a train had been sent for our relief. And this did at last happen, and towards the hour of dinner we rejoined our anxious friends. And all the evening time we boasted of a pleasant day, and urged them to go even as we had gone. The theory of quotation. The nobler method of quotation is not to quote at all, for why should one repeat good things that are already written? Are not the words in their fittest context in the original? Clearly, then, your new setting cannot be quite so congruous, which is, forthwith, an admission of incongruity. Your quotation is evidently a plug and a leak, an apology for a gap in your own words. But your vulgar author will even go out of his way to make the clothing of his thoughts thus heterogeneous. He counts every stolen scrap he can work in an improvement, a literary caddis worm. Yet would he consider it improvement to put a piece of even the richest of old tapestry or gold embroidery into his new pair of breeks? The passion for quotation is peculiar to literature. We do not glory to quote our costume, dress in cast-off court robes, or furnish our houses from the marine store. Neither are we proud of alien initials on the domestic silver. We like things new and, primarily, our own. We have a wholesome instinct against infection, except, it seems, in the matter of ideas. An authorling will deliberately inoculate his copy with the inverted comma bacillus, till the page swims on steadily, counting the fever aglow of pure literary healthiness. Yet this reproduction, rightly considered, is merely a proof that his appetite for books has run beyond his digestion, or his industry may be to seek. You expect an omelette, and presently up come the unbroken eggs. A tissue of quotation wisely looked at is indeed but a motley garment, eloquent either of a fool or an idle knave in a fool's disguise. Nevertheless, at times, the truth must be told, we must quote. As for admitting that we have quoted, that is another matter altogether. But the other man's phrase will lie at times so close in one's mind to the trend of one's thoughts that, all virtue notwithstanding, they must needs run into the groove of it. There are phrases that lie about in the literary mind like orange peel on a pavement. You are down on them before you know where you are. But does this necessitate acknowledgment to the man, now in Hades, who sucked that orange and strewed the peel in your way? Rather, is it not more becoming to be angry at his careless anticipation? One may reasonably look at it in this way. What business has a man to think of things right in front of you? Poke his head, as it were, into your light. What right has he to set up dams and tunnel out of swallow holes to deflect the current of your thoughts? Surely you may remove these instructions if it suits you and put them where you will. Else all literature will presently be choked up and the making of books come to an end. One might as well walk 10 miles out of one's way because some deaf oaf or other chose to sit upon a necessary stile. Surely Shakespeare or Lamb, or what other source you contemplate, has had the thing long enough. Out of the road with them. Turn and turn about. And inverted commas are so inhospitable. If you must take in another man's offspring, you should surely try to make the poor foundlings feel at home. Away with such uncharitable distinctions between the children of the house and the stranger within your gates. I never see inverted commas, but I think of the necessary persecuted medieval Jew in yellow gabardine. At least, never put the name of the author you quote. Think of the feelings of the dead. Don't let the poor spirit take it to heart that its monumental sayings would pass unrecognised without your advertisement. You mean well, perhaps, but it is in the poorest taste. Yet I have seen patience on a monument honourably awarded to William Shakespeare and fenced in by commas from all intercourse with the general text. There is something so extremely dishonest, too, in acknowledging quotations. Possibly the good people who so contrive that such signatures as Shakespeare, Homer, or St. Paul appear to be written here and there to parts of their inferior work manage to justify the proceedings in their conscience. But it is uncommonly like hallmarking pewter on the strength of an infinitesimal tinge of silver therein. The point becomes at once clear if we imagine some obscure painter quoting the style of Raphael and fragments of his designs, and acknowledging his indebtedness by appending the master's signature. Blank forgery. And a flood of light was thrown on the matter by a chance remark of one of Euphemia's aunts. She is a great reader of pure fiction, anent a popular novel. "I am sure it must be a nice book," said she, "or she could not get all these people to write the mottos for the chapters." No, it's all very well to play with one's conscience. I have known men so sophisticated as to assert that unacknowledged quotation was wrong, but very few really reasonable people will, I think, refuse to agree with me that the only artistic, the only kindly, and the only honest method of quotation is plagiary. If you cannot plagiarize, surely it were better not to quote. On the Art of Staying at the Seaside, a meditation at Eastbourne. To stay at the seaside properly, one should not think. But even in staying at the seaside, there are intervals, waking moments when meals come, even if there are no appointed meal times. Moreover, now and then one must go to buy tobacco, a matter one can trust to no hireling, lest he get it dry. It cannot be always seaside, even as it cannot be always May, and through the gaps thought creeps in. Going over the cliff and along the parade, and down by the circulating library to the cigar divan, where they sell Parak tobacco, the swinging of one's legs seems to act like a pendulum to the clockwork of one's brain. One meditates all the way, and chiefly on how few people there are who can really, to a critical adept, be said to stay at the seaside. People seem to think that one can take a ticket to Eastbourne or Bognor or Ventnor and come and stay at the seaside straight away, just as I have now new-hatched undergraduates tell people they were going to play billiards. Thousands and thousands of people think they have stayed at the seaside and have not, just as thousands of people erroneously imagine they have played whist. For the latter have played not whist, but bumble puppy, and the former have only frequented a watering place for a time. Your true staying at the seaside is an art, demanding not only railway fares, but special aptitude and, moreover, needing culture like all worthy arts. The most insurmountable difficulty of the beginner is the classical simplicity of the whole thing. To stay at the seaside properly, you just spread yourself out on the extreme edge of the land and let the sunlight soak in. Your eyes are fixed upon the horizon. Some have it that your head should be towards the sea, but the best authorities think that this determines blood to that region and so stimulates thought. This is all the positive instruction. The rest is prohibition. You must not think, and you must not move. Neither may you go to sleep. In a few minutes, the adept becomes as a god, even as a god that sits upon the lotus leaf. New light and colour come into the sky and the sea, and the surges chant his praises. But those who are not of the elect get pins and needles all over them. It must be freely admitted that staying at the seaside such as this, staying at the seaside in its perfection, is a thing for a select few. You want a broad stretch of beach and all the visible sea to yourself. You cannot be disturbed by even the most idyllic children trying to bury you with sand and such like playfulness, nor by boatloads of the democracy rowing athwart your sea and sky. And the absence of friend or wife goes without saying. I notice down here a very considerable quantity of evidently married pairs, and the huge majority of the rest of the visitors run in couples and are, to all appearances, engaged. If they are not, I would submit that they ought to be. Probably there is a certain satisfaction in sitting by the sea with the girl you are in love with, or your wife for that matter, just as many people undoubtedly find tea with milk and sugar very nice. But the former is no more the way to get the full and perfect pleasure of staying at the seaside than the latter is the way to get the full and perfect flavour of the tea. True, staying at the seaside is neither the repetition of old conversations in new surroundings, nor the exposure of one's affections to ozone. It is something infinitely higher. It is pure quiescence, of awaking inanition, savouring of Buddha and the divine. Now, staying at the seaside is so rarely done well because of the littleness of man. To do it properly needs many of the elements of greatness. Your common man, while he has life in him, can't let neither himself nor the universe alone. He must be asserting himself in some way, even if it is only by flinging pebbles at a stick. That self-forgetfulness, which should be a delight, is a terror to him. He brings down dog to the beach to stand between him and the calm of nature and yelp. He does worse than that. The meditative man, going daily over by the cliff and along the parade to get his ounce of tobacco, has a sad spectacle of what human beings may be driven to in this way. One sees altogether some hundreds of people there who have heard perhaps that staying at the seaside is good, and who have anyhow got thus far towards it and stopped. They have not the faintest idea how to make themselves happy. The general expression is veiled curiosity. They sit, mostly with their backs to the sea, talking poorly of indifferent topics and watching one another. Most obviously, they want hints of what to do with themselves. Behind them is a bank of flowers like those in Battersea Park, and another parallel parade, and beyond are bathing machines. The pier completely cuts the horizon out of the background. There is a stout lady in dark blue bathing. The only glances directed seaward are furtive ones at her. Many seem to be doubting whether this is not what they came down for. Others lean dubiously to the invitation of the boatman. Others again listen to vocalists and dramatic outcasts who, for halfpence, render obvious the reason of their professional degradation. It seems eccentric to travel 70 or 80 miles to hear a man without a voice demonstrate that he is unfit to have one, but they do. Any curious in these matters need only go to a watering place to see and, what is worse, to hear for himself. After an excursion train to Eastbourne, upward of 1,000 people have been seen thus heaped together over an oblong space of a mile long by 20 yards wide. Only 3 miles away, there was a towering white cliff overhanging a practically desert beach, and one seagull circled above one solitary, motionless, supine man, really staying at the seaside. You cannot walk 6 miles anywhere along the south coast without coming upon one of these heaps of people, called a watering place. There will be a town of houses behind, wherein the people lodge until, as they think, they have stayed a sufficient time at the sea, and they return, hot, cross, and mystified, to London. The seafront will be bricked or paved for a mile or so, and there will be rows of boats and bathing machines and other contrivances to screen off the view of the sea. And, as we have indicated, watering places and staying by the seaside are incompatible things. The true stayer by the seaside goes into the watering places because he must, because there is little food, and that uncooked, and no tobacco between the cliffs and the sea. Having purchased what he needs, he flees forth again. What time the whole selvage of England becomes watering place, there will be no more staying by the seaside at all in the land. But this is a gloomy train of thought that we will not pursue. There have been those who assert that one end of staying at the seaside is bathing, but it is easy to show that this is not so. Your proper bathing place is up the river, where the trees bend to the green and brown shadows of the water. There the bath is sweet, fresh out of sky, or but just filtered through the blue hills of distant watershed, and is set about with flowers. But the sea has stood there since the beginning of things, and with small prospect of change, says Kipling, to all eternity. The water in the sea, geologists tell us, has not been changed for 50 million years. The same chemist who sets me against all my food with his chemical names speaks of the sea as a weak solution of drowned men. Be that as it may, it leaves the skin harsh with salt and the hair sticky. Moreover, it is such a promiscuous bathing place. However, we need scarcely depreciate the sea as a bath, for what need is there of that when the river is clearly better? No one can deny that the river is better. People who bathe in the sea bathe by mistake, because they have come to the side of the sea and know not how else to use it. So too with the boating. It is hard to imagine how human beings who have drifted down streams and watched the brown fish in the shallows and peered through the tall sedges at the forget-me-nots, and fought with the ropes of the water lilies and heard the ripple under the bows, can ever think of going to and fro, pitching spasmodically in front of a watering place. And as for fishing, they catch fish at sea, indeed, but it is not fishing at all. Neither rods nor flies have they, and that is an end to the matter. An Eastbourne meditative man, returning to where he stays with his daily ounce of tobacco already afire, sees in the streets what are called by the natives cherry bangs, crowded with people, and, further, cabriolets and such vehicles holding parties and families. The good folks are driving away from the sea for the better part of the day, going to Battle and other places inland. The puzzle of what to do with their sea is too much for them, and they are going away for a little to rest their minds. Regarded as a centre of drives, one might think an inland place would be preferable to a seaside town, which at best commands but a half circle. However that may be, the fact remains that one of the chief occupations of your common visitor to the seaside is going away from it. Than this fact there can be nothing more conclusive in support of my argument that ordinary people are absolutely ignorant and incapable of staying by the seaside. Concerning chess. The passion for playing chess is one of the most unaccountable in the world. It slaps the theory of natural selection in the face. It is the most absorbing of occupations, the least satisfying of desires, an aimless experience upon life. It annihilates a man. You have, let us say, a promising politician, a rising artist that you wish to destroy. Dagger or bomb are archaic, clumsy, and unreliable. But teach him, inoculate him with chess. It is well, perhaps, that the right way of teaching chess is so little known, that consequently, in most cases, the plot fails in the performance. The dagger turns aside. Else we should all be chess players. There would be none left to do the business of the world. Our statesmen would sit with pocket-balls while the country went to the devil. Our army would bury itself in checkered contemplation. Our breadwinners would forget their wives in seeking after impossible mates. The whole world would be disorganized. I can fancy this abominable hypnotism so wrought into the constitution of men that the cabmen would go trying to drive their horses in knight's moves up and down Charing Cross Road. And now and again a suicide would come to hand, with the pathetic inscription pinned to his chest, "I checked with my queen too soon. I cannot bear the thought of it." There is no remorse like the remorse of chess. Only, happily, as we say, chess is taught the wrong way round. People put out the board before the learner with all the men in battle array, 16 aside with different kinds of moves, and the poor wretch is simply crushed and appalled. A lot of things happen, mostly disagreeable, and then a mate comes looming up through the haze of pieces. So he goes away, awestruck but unharmed, secretly believing that all chess players are humbugs, and that intelligent chess, which is neither chancy nor rote-learned, is beyond the wit of man. But clearly this is an unreasonable method of instruction. Before the beginner can understand the beginning of the game, he must surely understand the end. How can he commence playing until he knows what he is playing for? It is like starting athletes on a race and leaving them to find out where the winning post is hidden. Your true teacher of chess, your subtle chest poisoner, your cunning Comus, who changes men to chess players, begins quite the other way round. He will, let us say, give you king, queen, and pawn placed out in careless possible positions. So you master the militant possibilities of queen and pawn without perplexing complications. Then king, queen, and bishop, perhaps. King, queen, and knight, and so on. It ensures that you always play a winning game in these happy days of your chess childhood, and taste the one sweet of chess playing, the delight of having the upper hand of a better player. Then to more complicated positions, and at last back to the formal beginning. You begin to see now to what end the array is made, and understand why one gambit differeth from another in glory and virtue, and the chess mania of your teacher cleaveth to you thenceforth and for evermore. It is a curse upon a man. There is no happiness in chess. Mr. St. George Mivet, who can find happiness in the strangest places, would be at a loss to demonstrate it upon the chessboard. The mild delight of a pretty mate is the least unhappy phase of it. But, generally, you find afterwards that you ought to have mated 2 moves before, or at the time that an unforeseen reply takes your queen. No chess player sleeps well. After the painful strategy of the day, one fights one's battles over again. You see with more than daylight clearness that it was the rook you should have moved, and not the knight. No, it is impossible. No common sinner, innocent of chess, knows these lower deeps of remorse. Vast desert boards lie for the chess player beyond the gates of horn. Stalwart rooks ram headlong at one, knights hop sidelong. One's pawns are all tied, and a mate hangs threatening and never descends. And once chess has been begun in the proper way, it is flesh of your flesh, bone of your bone. You are sold, and the bargain is sealed, and the evil spirit hath entered in. The proper outlet for the craving is the playing of games, and there is a class of men, shadowy, unhappy, unreal-looking men, who gather in coffee-houses and play with a desire that dieth not, and a fire that is not quenched. These gather in clubs and play tournaments, such tournaments as he of the Table Round could never have imagined. But there are others who have the vice, who live in country places, in remote situations, curates, schoolmasters, rate collectors, who go consumed from day to day and meet no fit companion, and who must needs find some artificial vent for their mental energy. No one has ever calculated how many sound problems are possible, and no doubt the physical research people would be glad if Professor Carl Pearson would give his mind to the matter. All the possible dispositions of the piece come to such a vast number. However, that according to the theory of probability, and allowing a few thousand arrangements each day, the same problem ought never to turn up more than twice in a century or so. As a matter of fact, it is probably due to some flaw in the theory of probability, the same problem as a way of turning up in different publications several times in a month or so. It may be, of course, that, after all, quite sound problems are limited in number, and that we keep on inventing and reinventing them. That if a record were kept, the whole system up to 4 or 5 moves might be classified and placed on record in the course of a few score years. Indeed, if we were to eliminate those with conspicuously bad moves, it may be we should find the number of reasonable games was limited enough, and that even our brilliant Lasker is but repeating the inspirations of some long-buried Persian, some mute inglorious Hindu, dead and forgotten ages since. It may be, over every game there watches the forgotten forerunners of the players, and that chess is indeed a dead game, a haunted game, played out centuries ago even, as beyond all cavil is the game of draughts. The artistic temperament, the gay, irresponsible cast of mind, does what it can to lighten the gravity of this too intellectual game. To a mortal, there is something indescribably horrible in these champions with their 4 moves an hour, The bare thought of the mental operations of the 15 minutes gives one a touch of headache. Compulsory, quick moving is the thing for gaiety, and that is why, though we revere Steinitz and Lasker, it is Bird we love. His victories glitter, his errors are magnificent. The true sweetness of chess, if it ever can be sweet, is to see a victory snatched by some happy impertinence out of the shadow of apparently irrevocable disaster. And talking of cheerfulness reminds me of Lowson's historical game of chess. Lowson said he had been cheerful sometimes, but drunk. Perish the thought. Challenged, he would have proved it by some petty tests of pronunciation, some Good Templars' shibboleths. He offered to walk along the curb, to work any problem in mathematics we could devise, finally to play McBride at chess. The other gentleman was appointed judge, and after putting the antimacassar over his head, Judge Wishk immediately went to sleep in a disorderly heap on the sofa. The game was begun very solemnly, so I am told. McBride, in describing it to me afterwards, swayed his hands about with the fingers twiddling in a weird kind of way, and said the board went like that. The game was fierce, but brief. It was presently discovered that both kings had been taken. Lowson was hard to convince, but this came home to him. "Man," he is reported to have said to McBride, "I am just drunk. There is no doubt in the matter. I am feeling very ashamed of myself." It was accordingly decided to declare the game drawn. The position, as I found it next morning, is an interesting one. Lowson's queen was at KT6, his bishop at QB3. He had several pawns, and his knight occupied a commanding position at the intersection of 4 squares. McBride had 4 pawns, 2 rooks, a queen, a draught, and a small mantle ornament arranged in a rough semicircle athwart the board. I have no doubt chess exquisites will sneer at this position, but in my opinion it is one of the cheerfulest I have ever seen. I remember I admired it very much at the time, in spite of a slight headache, and it is still the only game of chess that I recall with undiluted pleasure. And yet I have played many games. A study in domestic aesthetics. Euphemia, who loves to have home dainty and delightful, would have no coals if she could dispense with them, much less a coal scuttle. Indeed, it would seem she would have no fireplace at all if she had her will. All the summer she is happy, and the fireplace is anything but the place for a fire. The fender has vanished. The fire irons are gone. It is draped and decorated and disguised. So would dear Euphemia drape and disguise the whole iron framework of the world with that decorative and decent mind of hers, had she but the scope. There are exotic ferns there, spreading like fan-like fronds, and majolica glows and gleams, and fabrics of which Morris is the actual or spiritual begetter delight the eye. In summertime, our fireplace is indeed a thing of beauty, but alas for the solar system, it is not a joy forever. The sun at last recedes beyond the equinoxes, and the black bogey who has slept awakens again. Euphemia restores the fender curb, and the brazen dogs, and the fire irons that will clatter, and then All the winter, whenever she sits before the fire, her trouble is with her. Even when the red glow of the fire lights up her features most becomingly, and flattery is in her ear, every now and then a sidelong glance at her ugly foe shows that the thought of it is in her mind, and that the crumpled rose-leaf, if such a phrase may be used for a coal scuttle, insists on being felt. And she has even been discovered alone, sitting elbows on knees and chin on her small clenched fist, frowning at it, puzzling how to circumvent the one enemy of her peace. It is what Euphemia always calls this utensil, when she can bring herself to give the indescribable and imperfect vent in speech. But commonly the feeling is too deep for words. Her war with this foeman in her household, this coarse rebel in her realm of soft prettiness, is one of those silent ones, those grim struggles without outcry or threat or appeal for quarter that can never end in any compromise, never find a rest in any truce, except the utter defeat of the antagonist. And how she has tried! The happy thoughts, the faint hopes, the new departures and outflanking movements. And even today, there the thing defies her, a coal box with a broad smile that shows its black teeth, thick and squat, filling a snug corner and swaggering in on manly triumph over the outrage upon her delicacy that it commits. One of Euphemia's brightest ideas was to burn wood. Logs make even a picturesque pile in a corner look uncommon. But there are objections to wood. Wood, finely divided, burns with gay quirks and jets of flame, and making cheerful crackling noises the while. But its warmth and brightness are as evanescent as love's young dream. And your solid log has a certain irritating inertness. It is an absentee fuel, spending its fire up the chimney, and after its youthful clouds of glory turns but a cheerless side of black and white char towards the room. And, above all, the marital mind is strangely exasperated by the log. Smite it with the poker, and you get but a sullen resonance, a flight of red sparks, a sense of unconquerable toughness. It is worse than coke. The crisp fracture of coal, the spitting flames suddenly leaping into existence from the shiny new fissures, are altogether wanting. Old seasoned timber burns indeed most delightfully, but then it is as ugly as coal, and withal very dear. So Euphemia went back to coal again with a sigh. Possibly, if Euphemia had been surrounded by the wealth she deserves, this trouble would not have arisen. A silent servant, bearing the due dose of fresh fuel, would have come gliding from a mysterious beneath, restored the waning animation of the grate, and vanished noisily again. But this was beyond the range of Euphemia's possibilities, and so we are face to face with this problem of the scuttle again. At first she would feign there was no such thing as coal. It was too horrible. Only a Zola would admit it. It was the epoch of concealment. The thing purchased was like a little cupboard on four legs. It might have held any convenient trifle, and there was a shelf upon the top, and a book of poetry, and a piece of crackled satsuma. You took a little brass handle, pulled it down, and the front of the little cupboard came forward, and there you found your coal. But a dainty little cupboard can no more entertain black coal and inelegant firewood and keep its daintiness than a mind can entertain black thoughts and yet be sweet. This cabinet became demoralized with amazing quickness. It became incontinent with its corruptions. A hinge got twisted, and after a time it acquired the habit of suddenly, and with an unpleasant, oscillatory, laughing noise, opening of its own accord, and proclaiming its horrid secret to Euphemia's best visitors. An air of wickedness at once precocious and senile came upon it. It gaped and leered at Euphemia as the partner of her secret, with such a familiar air of I and you, that she could stand it no longer, and this depraved piece of furniture was banished at last from her presence, and relegated to its proper sphere of sham gentility below stairs, where it easily passed itself upon the cook as an exquisite. Euphemia tried to be sensible then, and determined, since she must have coal in her room, to let no false modesty intervene, but to openly proclaim its presence to all the world. The next thing, therefore, was a cylinder of brass, broadly open above, saying to the world, as it were, "Look, I contain coal." And there were brass tongs, like sugar tongs, wherewith Euphemia would regale the fire and brighten it up, handing it a lump at a time in the prettiest way. But brass dints. The brazen thing was quiet and respectable enough upstairs, but ever and again it went away to be filled. What happened on those holiday jaunts Euphemia has never ascertained. But a chance blow, or worse, could run a crease athwart the forehead of the thing, and blow an almost imperceptible bulging hinted at a future corpulency. And there was complaint of the quantity of polishing it needed, and an increasing difficulty in keeping it bright. And except when it was full to the brim, the lining was unsightly, and this became more so. One day Ithuriel must have visited Euphemia's apartment, and the tarnished brilliancy of the thing stood confessed. For some days there was an interregnum and a coal scuttle from downstairs, a black, unstable thing on flat foot, and with a vast foolish nether lip, did its duty with inelegant faithfulness. Then Euphemia had a really pretty fancy. She procured one of those big open garden baskets and painted it a pleasant brown, and instead of a garden fork she had a little half horticultural scoop. In this basket she kept her coals, and she tied a pink ribbon on the handle. One might fancy she had been in some dewy garden, and had dug a few coals as one might dig up bulbs, and brought them in and put them down. It attracted attention from all her visitors, and set a kind of fashion in the neighbourhood. For a time Euphemia was almost contented. But one day a malignant woman called, and looked at this device through her gilt eye-glasses, while she secretly groped in the dark of her mind for an unpleasant thing to say. Then suddenly she remarked, "Why not put your coal in a bassinet, or keep it all on the floor?" Euphemia's face fell. The thing was undeniably very like a cradle. In the light of this suggestion, the coal certainly did seem a little out of place there, and besides, if there were more than 3 or 4 lumps, they had a way of tumbling over the edge upon the carpet when the fire was replenished. The tender shoot of Euphemia's satisfaction suddenly withered and died. So the struggle has gone on. Sometimes it has been a wrought iron tripod with a subtle tendency to upset in certain directions. Sometimes a coal box, once even the noisy old coal box of japanned tin, making more noise than a Salvation Army service, and strangely decorated with art enamels, had a turn. At present, Euphemia is enduring a walnut casket that, since its first week of office, has displayed an increasing indisposition to shut. But things cannot stay like this. The worry and anxiety and vexation, Euphemia declares, are making her old before her time. A delicate woman should not be left alone to struggle against brazen monsters. A closed gas stove is happily impossible, but the husband of the household is threatened with one of those beastly sham fires, wherein gas jets flare among firebrick, a mechanical fire without vitality or variety, that never dances nor crackles nor blazes, a monotonous horror, a fire you cannot poke. That is what it will certainly come to if the problem remains unsolved. Bar Garrow. Frankly, I detest this Bar Garrow. Yet it is quite generally conceded that Bar Garrow is a very well-meaning fellow. But the trouble is to understand him. To do that, I have been at some pains, and yet I am still a mere theorist. An anthropometric estimate of the man fails to reveal any reason for the distinction of my aversion. He is of passable height, breadth, and density, and, save for a certain complacency of expression, I find no salient objection in his face. He has bluish eyes and a whitish skin, and average-coloured hair, none of them distinctly indictable possessions. It is something in his interior and on-scene mechanism, I think, that must be wrong. Some internal lesion that finds expression in his acts. His mental operations, indeed, were at first as inconceivable to me as a crab's or a cockchafer's. That is where all the trouble came in. For that reason alone, they fascinated me and aggrieved me. From the conditions of our acquaintance, we were colleagues. I had to study him with some thoroughness, observing him under these circumstances and those. I have, by the by, sometimes wondered idly how he would react to alcohol, a fluid he avoids. It would, I am sure, be an entirely novel and remarkable kind of drunk, and I am also certain it would be an offensive one. But I can't imagine it. I have no data. I could as soon evolve from my inner consciousness an intoxicated giraffe. But, as I say, this interesting experience has hitherto been denied me. Now, my theory of Bar Garrow is this, that he has a kind of disease in his ideals, some interruption of nutrition that has left them small and emasculate. He aims, it appears, at a state called really nice, or the true gentleman, the outward and visible signs of which are a conspicuous quietness of costume, gloves in all weathers, and a tightly rolled umbrella. But coupled in some way with this is a queer smack of the propagandist, a kind of dwarfed prophetic passion. That is the particular oddness of him. He displays a timid yet persistent desire to foist this true gentleman of his upon an unwilling world, to make you really nice after his own pattern. I always suspect him of trying to convert me by stealth when I am not looking. So far as I can see, Bargarow's conception of this true gentleman of his is at best a compromise, mainly holiness, but a tinted kind of holiness, goodness in clean cuffs and with something neat in ties. He renounces the flesh and the devil willingly enough, but he wants to keep up a decent appearance. Now, a stark saint I can find sympathy for. I respect your prophet unkempt and in a hair shirt, denouncing sin and mundane affairs in general with hoarse passion and a fiery hate. I would not go for my holidays with, nor make a domestic pet of such a man, but I respect him. But Bargarow's pose is different. Bargarow would call that carrying things to extremes. He is an unobtrusive virtue, a compromising dissent, inaggressive aggressions on sin. So I take it, and at times he puts it to you in a drawling argument, a stream of Bargarowisms, until you have to hurt his feelings. Happily, he is always getting his feelings hurt, just to stop the flow of him.
Life, said Bargarow, in a moment of expansiveness, is scarcely worth living unless you are doing good to someone.
That I take to be the keystone of him.
I want to be a good influence upon all the people I meet.
I do not think it has ever dawned upon him that he himself is in any way short of perfection, and so far as I can see, the triumph and end of his good influence is cleanliness of cuff, compactness of umbrella, and general assimilation to the Bargarow ideal. Hear him upon one's social duties, this living soul in this world of wonders.
In moderation,
said Bargarow, opening out to questions on that matter.
Social relaxation is desirable, and I will even go so far as to admit that I think it well to have at hand some pleasant expedient for entertaining people and passing the time. A humorous song or a recitation, provided it is in really good taste, is harmless enough, and sometimes it may even be turned to good account. And everyone should try to master some instrument or other. The flute, perhaps, is as convenient as any, for the fiddle and piano, you know, are difficult and expensive to learn, and require constant practice. A little legerdemain is also a great acquisition for a man. Some may differ from me in that, continued Bargarow. But I see no harm in it. There are hundreds of perfectly proper and innocent tricks with coins and bits of paper and pieces of string that will make an evening pass most delightfully. One may get quite a little reputation as an entertainer with these things. And it is, pursued Bargarow, quite glowing with liberality, just a little pharisaical to object to card tricks. There are quantities of really quite clever and mathematical things that one may do with a chosen card, dealing the pack into heaps and counting slowly. Of course, it is not for mere pleasuring that I learn these things. It gives anyone with a little tact an opportunity for stopping card-playing. When the pack is brought in and all the party are intent upon gaming, you may seize your opportunity and take the cards, saying, "Let me show you a little trick," or "Have you seen Masculine's new trick with the cards?" Before anyone can object, you are displaying your skill to their astonishing eyes, and in their wonder at your cleverness, the objectionable game may be indefinitely postponed. Yet, so set at times is your gambler upon his abominable pursuit, says Bargarow, that in practice even this ingenious expedient has been known to fail.
He tried it once, it seems, in a race train to Kempton Park, and afterwards he had to buy a new hat. That incident, indeed, gives you the very essence of Bargaro in his insidious attacks on evil. I remember that on another occasion he went out of his way to promise a partially intoxicated man a drink, and taking him into a public house, ordered 2 lemon squashes. Drinks! He liked lemon squash himself, and he did not like beer, and he thought he had only to introduce the poor fallen creature to the delights of temperance to ensure his conversion there and then. I think he expected the man to fall upon him, crying, "My benefactor!" But he did not say "my benefactor," at any rate, though he fell upon him, cheerfully enough. To avoid the appearance of priggishness, which he dreads with some reason, he even went so far as to procure a herb tobacco, which he smokes with the help of frequent sulphur matches. This he recommends to us strongly. "Won't you try it?" he says, with a winning smile. "Just once." And he is the only man I have ever met who drinks that facetious fluid, non-alcoholic beer. Once he proposed to wean me upon that from my distinctive vice, which led indeed to our first rupture. "I find it delicious," he said in pathetic surprise. It is one of his most inveterate habits to tell you quietly what he does, or would do, under the circumstances. Seeing you at Kipling, he will propound the proposition that all true literature has a distinct aim. His test of literary merit is, what good does it do you? He is a great lender of books, especially of Carlyle and Ruskin, which authors, for some absolutely inscrutable reason, he considers provocative of barbarism, and he goes to the county council lectures on dairy work because it encourages others to improve themselves. But I have said enough to display him, and of Bargaro, at least, as I can well testify, it is easy to have more than enough. Indeed, after whole days with him, I have gone home to dream of the realization of his ideals, a sort of Bargaro millennium, a world of Bargaros, all kinds of men, Falstaffs, Don Quixotes, Alan Stewarts, John the Baptist, John Knox, Quilps, and Benevito Salinas, all, so to speak, Bargaroed, all with clean cuffs, tight umbrellas, and temperate ways, passing to and fro in a regenerate earth. And so he goes on his way through this wonderful universe with his eyes fixed upon 2 or 3 secondary things, without the lust or pride of life, without curiosity or adventure, a mere timid missionary of a religion of nicer ways, a quiet setter of a good example. I can assure you this is no exaggeration, but a portrait. It seems to me that the thing must be pathological, that he and this goodness of his have exactly the same claim upon Lombroso, let us say, as the born criminal. He is born good, a congenital good example, a sufferer from atrophy of his original sin. The only hope I can see for Bargaro, short of murder, is forcible trepanning. He ought to have the seat of his ideals lanced, and all this wash about doing good to people by stealth taken away. It may be he might prove a very decent fellow then, if there was anything left of him, that is. The Book of Essays, Dedicatory. I have been bothered about this book this 3 months. I have written scarcely anything since Llewellyn asked me for it, for when he asked me I had really nothing on hand. I had just published every line I have ever written at my own expense with Brigsby's. Yet 3 months should suffice for one of Llewellyn's books, which consist chiefly of decorous fly-leaves and a dedication or so, and margins. Of course, you know Llewellyn's books, the most delightful things in the market, the sweetest covers with little gilt apples and things carelessly distributed over luminous grey and bright red initials, and all these delightful fopperies. But it was the very slightness of these biblots that disorganised me, and perhaps also the fact that no one has ever asked me for a book before. I had no trouble with the title, though. Lichens. I have wondered the thing was never used before. Lichens, variegated, beautiful, though on the most arid foundations, half fungoid, half vernal, the very name for a booklet of modern verse. And that, of course, decided the key of the cover, and disposed of 3 or 4 pages. A flyleaf, a leaf with lichens, printed fair and beautiful a little to the left of centre, then a title page, Lichens, by H. G. Wells, London, 1895. Stephen Llewellyn. Then a restful blank page, and then the dedication. It was the dedication stopped me. The title page, it is true, had some points of difficulty. Should the Christian name be printed in full or not, for instance, but it had none of the fatal fascination of the dedicatory page. I had, so to speak, to look abroad among the ranks of men and make one of those fretful, forgotten millions immortal. It seemed a congenial task. I went to work forthwith. It was only this morning that I realised the magnitude of my accumulations. Ever since then, it was 3 months ago, I have been elaborating this dedication. I turned the pile over, idly at first. Presently, I became interested in tracing my varying moods as they had found a record in the heap. This struck me. Then again, a little essay in gratitude came to hand. To Professor Augustus Flood, whose admirable lectures on paleontology first turned my attention to literature. There was a tinge of pleasantry in the latter that pleased me very greatly when I wrote it, and I find immediately overlying it another essay in the same line. To the latter-day reviewer, these pearls. For some days I was smitten with the idea of dedicating my little booklet to one of my numerous personal antagonists, and conveying some subtly devised insult with an air of magnanimity. I thought, for instance, of Blizzard. Sir Joseph Blizzard, the most distinguished, if not the greatest, of contemporary anatomists. I think it was Excel's books about Dubulus aut nihil that set me upon another line. There is, after all, your reader to consider in these matters, your average middle-class person to impress in some way. They say the creature is a snob and absolutely devoid of any tinge of humour, and I must confess that I more than half believe it. At any rate, It was that persuasion inspired To the Countess of X, in memory of happy days. I know no Countess of X, as a matter of fact, but if the public is such an ass as to think better of my work for the suspicion, I do not care how soon I incur it. And this, again, is a pretty utilisation of the waste desert of politics. My dear Salisbury, pray accept this unworthy tribute of my affectionate esteem. There were heaps of others, and looking at those heaps, it suddenly came sharp and vivid before my mind that there was the book I needed already written. A blank page, a dedication, a blank page, a dedication, and so on. I saw no reason to change the title. It only remained to select the things, and the book was done. I set to work at once, and in a very little while my bibliot was selected. There were dedications fulsome and fluid, dedications acrid and uncharitable, dedications in verse, and dedications in the dead languages, all sorts and conditions of dedications, even the simple, to J. H. Gables, so suggestive of the modest white stones of the village churchyard. Altogether, I picked out 103 dedications. At last, only one thing remained to complete the book, and that was the dedication. You will scarcely credit it, but that worries me still. I am almost inclined to think that dedications are going out of fashion. Through a microscope, some moral reflections. This dabbler person has recently disposed of his camera and obtained a microscope. A short, complacent-looking implement it is, of brass. And he goes about everywhere now with little glass bottles in his pocket, ready to jump upon any stray pollywoggle he may find, and hale it home and pry into its affairs. Within his study window are perhaps 6 jars and basins full of green scum and choice specimens of black mud in which his victims live. He persists in making me look through this instrument, though I would rather I did not. It seems to me a kind of impropriety even when I do it. He gets innumerable things in a drop of green water and puts it on a glass slip under the object glass, and, of course, they know nothing of the change in their condition and go on living just as they did before they were observed. It makes me feel at times like a public moralist, or Peeping Tom of Coventry, or some such creature. Certainly, there are odd things enough in the water, among others, certain queer green things that are neither plants nor animals. Most of the time, they are plants, quiet green threads matted together, but every now and then the inside of one comes out, so to speak, and starts off with a fine red eye and a long flickering tail to see the world. The dabbler says it's quite a usual thing among the lower plants, algae he calls them for some reason, to disgorge themselves in this way and go swimming about. But it has quite upset my notions of things. If the lower plants, why not the higher? It may be my abominable imagination, but since he told me about these swarm spores, I think he called them, I don't feel nearly so safe with my geraniums as I did. A particularly objectionable thing in these water drops, the dabbler insists upon my spying at is the furious activity of everything you see in them. You look down his wretched tube, and there, bright and yellow with the lamplight in the round field of the microscope, is a perfect riot of living things. Perhaps it's the water he got from Hampstead, and a dozen flat things the shape of shortbreads will be fussing about. They are all quite transparent and colourless, and move about like galleys by means of a lot of minute oars that stick out all over them, never a moment's rest. And presently one sees that even the green plant threads are wriggling across the field. The dabbler tries to moralise on this in the vein of Charles Kingsley, and infer we have much to learn from these ridiculous creatures. But, so far as I can see, it's a direct incentive to sloth to think how low in the scale of creation these things are, in spite of all their fussing. If they had sat about more and thought, they might be fishing the dabbler out of ponds, and examining him instead of his examining them. Your energetic people might do worse things than have a meditative half-hour at the microscope. Then there are green things with a red spot and a tail that creep about like slugs and are equally transparent. Eugelina viridis, the dabbler calls them, which seems unnecessary information. In fact, all the things he shows me are transparent. Even the little one-eyed crustacea, the size of a needlepoint, that discredits the name of Cyclops. You can see their digestion and muscle and nerve and, in fact, everything. It's at least a blessing we are not the same. Fancy the audible comments of the temperance advocate when you get in the bus. No use pulling yourself together then. Pretty full. And, look, people would say, his wife gives him cold mutton. Speaking of the name of Cyclops reminds me that these scientific people have been playing a scurvy trick upon the classics behind our backs. It reminds one of Epistemon's visit to Hades, when he saw Alexander a patcher of clouts and Xerxes a crier of mustard. Aphrodite, the dabbler tells me, is a kind of dirty mudworm, and much dissected by spectacled pretenders to the London BSc. Every candidate, says the syllabus, must be able to dissect, to the examiner's satisfaction, and demonstrate upon Aphrodite, Nereus, Palaemon. Were the gods ever so insulted? Then the snaky Medusa and Pandora, our mother, are jellyfish. Astrea is still to be found on coral reefs, a poor thing and much browsed upon by parrotfish, and Doris and Tethys and Cydippe are sea slugs. It's worse than Heine's vision of the gods grown old. They can't be content with the departed gods merely. Everdeen is a water flea. They'll make something out of Mrs. Sarah Grand next. An Autolycus. My Autolycus is a polymorphic worm. Whatever subtlety of insult polymorphic worm may convey. However, I wander from the microscope. These shortbread things are fussing about hither and thither across the field, and now and then an amoeba comes crawling into view. These are invertebrate jelly-like things of no particular shape, and they keep on thrusting out a part here and withdrawing a part there, and changing and advancing just as though they were popular democratic premiers. Then diatoms keep gliding athwart the circle. These diatoms are, to me at least, the most perplexing things in the universe. Imagine a highly ornamental thing in white and brown, the shape of a spectacle case, without any limbs or other visible means of progression, and without any wriggling of the body, or indeed any apparent effort at all, gliding along at a smart pace. That's your diatom. The dabbler really knows nothing of how they do it. He mumbles something about Butchley and Grenville. Imagine things on a larger scale. Cleopatra's Needle, for instance, travelling on its side up the Thames embankment, and all unchaperoned, at the rate of 4 or 5 miles an hour. There's another odd thing about these microscope things which redeems, to some extent at least, their singular frankness. To use the decorous phrase of the textbook, they multiply by fission. Your amoeba, or vorticella, as the case may be, splits in 2. Then there are 2 amoebae, or vorticellae. In this way, the necessity of the family, that middle-class institution so abhorrent to the artistic mind, is avoided. In my friend's drop of ditch water, as in heaven, there is neither marrying nor giving in marriage. There are no waste parents which should appeal to the scholastic mind, and the simple protozoon has none of that fitful fever of falling in love, that distressingly tender state that so bothers your mortal man. They go about their business with an enviable singleness of purpose, and when they have eaten and drunk and attained to the fullness of life, they divide and begin again with renewed zest the pastime of living. In a sense, they are immortal, for we may look at this matter in another light, and say our exuberant protozoon has shed a daughter and remains. In that case, the amoeba I look at may have crawled among the slime of the Silurian seas when the common ancestor of myself and the royal family was an unassuming mudfish like those in the reptile house in the zoo. His memoirs would be interesting. The thought gives a solemn tint to one's meditations. If the dabbler wash him off this slide into his tube of water again, this trivial creature may go on feeding and growing and dividing, and presently be thrown away to wider waters, and so escape to live after I am dead, after my masterpieces are forgotten, after our empire has passed away, after the human animal has passed through I know not what vicissitudes. It may be he will still, with the utmost nonchalance, be pushing out his pseudopodia and ingesting diatoms when the fretful transitory life of humanity has passed altogether from the earth. One may catch him in specimen tubes by the dozen, but still, when one thinks of this, it is impossible to deny him a certain envious, if qualified, respect. And all the time these creatures are living their vigorous, fussy little lives, in this drop of water they are being watched by a creature of whose presence they do not dream, who can wipe them all out of existence with a stroke of his thumb, and who is withal as finite and sometimes as fussy and unreasonably energetic as themselves. He sees them, and they do not see him, because he has senses that they do not possess, because he is too incredibly vast and strange to come, save as an overwhelming catastrophe, into their lives. Even so, it may be the dabbler himself is being curiously observed. The dabbler is good enough to say that the suggestion is inconceivable. I can imagine a decent amoeba saying the same thing. The pleasure of quarrelling. Your cultivated man is apt to pity the respectable poor on the score of their lack of small excitements, and even in the excess of his generous sympathy to go to a Toynbee hailing in their cause. And Sir Walter Besant once wrote a book about Hoxton, saying, among other things, how monotonous life was there. That is your modern fallacy respecting the lower middle class. One might multiply instances. The tenor of the pity is always the same. No music, says the cultivated man. No pictures, no books to read, nor leisure to read in. How can they pass their lives? The answer is simple enough, as Emily Bronte knew. They quarrel. And an excellent way of passing the time it is. So excellent indeed that the pity were better inverted. But we all lack the knowledge of our chiefest needs. In the first place, and mainly, it is hygienic to quarrel. It disengages floods of nervous energy. The pulse quickens, the breathing is accelerated, the digestion improved. Then it sets one's stagnant brains astir and quickens the imagination. It clears the mind of vapours as thunder clears the air. And, finally, it is a natural function of the body. In his natural state, man is always quarrelling, by instinct. Not to quarrel is indeed one of the vices of our civilization, one of the reasons why we are neurotic and anemic, and all these things. And at last our enfeebled palates have even lost the capacity for enjoying a jolly good row. There can be no more melancholy sight in the world than that of your young man or young woman suffering from suppressed pugnacity. Up to the end of the school years, it was well with them. They had ample scope for this wholesome commerce, the neat give and take of offence. In the family circle, too, there are still plentiful chances of acquiring the taste. Then, suddenly, they must be gentle and considerate and all the rest of it. A wholesome shindy, so soon as toga and long skirts arrive, is looked upon as positively wrong. Even the dear old institution of the cut is falling into disrepute. The quarrelling is all forced back into the system, as it were. It poisons the blood. This is why our literature grows sinister and bitter, and our daughters yearn after this and that, write odd books, and ride about on bicycles in remarkable clothes. They have shut down the safety valve. They suffer from the present lamentable increase of gentleness. They must find some outlet or perish. If they could only put their arms akimbo and tell each other a piece of their minds for a little, in the ancient way, there can be not the slightest doubt that much of this fin de siècle on wholesomeness would disappear. Possibly this fashion of gentleness will pass, yet it has had increasing sway now for some years. An unhealthy generation has arisen, among the more educated class at least, that quarrels little, regards the function as a vice or a nuisance, as the East Ender does a taste for fine art or literature. We seem, indeed, to be getting altogether out of the way of it. Rare quarrels, no doubt, occur to everyone, but rare quarrelling is no quarrelling at all. Like beer, Smoking, sea bathing, cycling, and the like delights you cannot judge of quarrelling by the early essay. But to show how good it is, did you ever know a quarrelsome person give up the use? Alcohol you may wean a man from, and Barry says he gave up the Arcadia mixture and De Quincey conquered opium. But once you are set as a quarreller, you quarrel and quarrel till you die. How to quarrel well and often has ever been something of an art, and it becomes more of an art with the general decline of spirit, for it takes two to make a quarrel. Time was when you turned to the handiest human being, and with small care or labour had the comfortable warmth you needed in a minute or so. There was theology. Even in the 50s, it was ample cause with 2 out of 3 you met. Now people will express a lamentable indifference. Then politics again. But a little while ago, fat for the fire of any male gathering is now a topic of mere tepidity. So you are forced to be more subtle, more patient in your quarrelling. You play like a little boy playing cricket with his sisters, with those who do not understand. A fellow votary is a rare treat. As a rule, you have to lure and humour your antagonist like a child. The wooing is as intricate and delicate as any wooing can well be. To quarrel now, indeed, requires an infinity of patience. The good old days of thumb-biting, "Do you bite your thumbs at us, sir?" and so to clash and stab, are gone forever. There are certain principles in quarrelling, however, that the true quarreller even bears in mind, and which, duly observed, do much to facilitate encounters. In the first place, cultivate distrust. Have always before you that this is a wicked world full of insidious people, and you never know what villainous encroachments upon you may be hidden under fair-seeming appearances. That is the flavour of it. At the first suspicion, stick up for your rights, as the vulgar say, and see that you do it suddenly. Smite promptly, and the surprise and sting of your injustice should provoke an excellent reply. And where there is least ground for suspicion, there, remember, is the most. The right hand of fellowship extended towards you is one of the best openings you have. Not such a fool is the kind of attitude to assume, and you don't put upon me easy. Your adversary resents this a little, and rankling tries to explain. You find a personal inference in the expostulation. Next to a wariness respecting your interests is a keen regard for your honour. Having concealed in the privacy of your mind a code of what is due to you, expand or modify it as occasion offers. Be, as it were, a collector of what are called slights, and never let one pass you. Watch your friend in doorways, passages, when he eats by you, when he drinks with you, when he addresses you, when he writes you letters. It will be hard if you cannot catch him smuggling some deadly insult into your presence. Tax him with it. He did not think, forsooth. Tell him no gentleman would do such a thing, thinkingly or not, that you certainly will not stand it again. Say you will show him. He will presently argue or contradict. So to your climax. Then, again, there is the personal reference. Meaning me, sir? Your victim with a blithe heart babbles of this or that. You let him meander here and there, watching him as if you were in ambush. Presently he comes into your spring. "Of course," you say. "I saw what you were driving at just this minute when you mentioned mustard in salad dressing. But if I am peppery, I am not mean. And if I have a thing to say, I say it straight out." A good gambit this, and well into him from the start. The particular beauty of this is that you get him apologetic at first, and can score heavily before he rises to the defensive. Then, finally, there is your abstract cause, once very fruitful indeed, but now sadly gone into decay, except perhaps in specialist society. As an example, let there be one who is jibing genially at some topic or other, at Japanese king crabs, or the inductive process, or any other topic which cannot possibly affect you one atom. Then is the time to drop all these merely selfish interests and to champion the cause of truth. Fall upon him in a fine glow of indignation, and bring your contradiction across his face, whack, so that all the table may hear. Tell him, with his pardon, that the king crab is no more a crab than you are a jellyfish, or that Mill has been superseded these 10 years. Ask, how can you say such things? From thence to his general knowledge is a short flight, and so to his veracity, his reasoning powers, his mere common sense. "Let me tell you, sir," is the special incantation for the storm. These are the 4 chief ways of quarrelling, the 4 gates to this delightful city. For it is delightful, once your prentice days are past. In a way, it is like a cold bath on a winter's morning, and you glow all day. In a way, it is like football, as the nimble aggravation dances to and fro. In a way, it is like chess. Indeed, all games of skill are watered quarrels, quarrel and soda. Come to see them in a proper light. And without quarrelling, you have not fully appreciated your fellow man. For in the ultimate, it is the train and complement of love, the shadow that rounds off the delight we take in poor humanity. It is the vinegar and pepper of existence. And long after our taste for sweets has vanished, it will be the solace of our declining years. The amateur nature lover. It is possible that an education entirely urban is not the best conceivable preparation for descriptive articles upon the country. On the other hand, your professional nature lover is sometimes a little over-familiar with his subject. He knows the names of all the things, and he does not spare you. Besides, he is subtle. The prominent features are too familiar to him, and he goes into details. What respectable townsman, for instance, knows what scabiosa is? It sounds very unpleasant. Then the professional nature lover assumes that you know trees. No Englishman can tell any tree from any other tree, except a very palpable oak or poplar, so that we may, at least as an experiment, allow a good Londoner to take his unsophisticated eyes out into the sweet country for once and try his skill at nature-loving, though this botany has been learned over the counter of flower shops, and his zoology on Saturday afternoons when they have the band in the gardens. He makes his way then over by Epsom Downs, towards Sutton, trying to assimilate his mood to the proper flavour of appreciation as he goes, and with a little notebook in the palm of his hand to assist an ill-trained memory. And the burthen of his song is, of course, the Autumn Tint. The masses of trees towards Epsom and Ewell, with the red houses and Elizabethan facades peeping through their interstices, contain, it would seem, every conceivable colour, except perhaps sky blue. There are brilliant yellow trees, and a kind of tree of the most amazing gamboge green, almost the green of spring come back, and tan-coloured trees, deep brown, red, and deep crimson trees. Here and there the wind has left its mark, and the grey-brown branches and their purple tracery of twigs, with a suggestion of infinite depth behind, show through the rents in the leafy covering. There are deep green trees. The amateur nature lover fancies they may be yews, with their dense, warm foliage arranged in horizontal masses, like the clouds low down in a sunset, and certain other evergreens, one particularly with a bluish-green covering of upstanding needles, are intensely conspicuous among the flame tints around. On a distant church tower, and nearer, disputing the possession of a gabled red house with a glowing creeper, is some ivy, and never is the perennial green of ivy so delightful as it is now, when all else is alight with the sombre fire of the sunset of the year. The amateur nature lover proceeds over the down, appreciating all this as hard as he can appreciate, and anon gazing up at the grey and white cloud shapes melting slowly from this form to that, and showing lakes and wide expanses and serene distances of blue between their gaps. And then he looks round him for a zoological item. Underfoot, the grass of the down is recovering from the summer drought and growing soft and green again, and plentiful little flattened snail shells lie about, and here and there a late harebell still nods in the breeze. Yonder bolts a rabbit, and then something whizzes by the amateur nature lover's ear. They shoot here somewhere, he remembers suddenly, and then, looking round in a palpitating state, is reassured by the spectacle of a lone golfer looming over the brow of the down and gesticulating black and weird against the sky. The Londoner, with an abrupt affectation of nonchalance, flings himself flat upon his back, and so remains comparatively safe until the golfer has passed. These golfers are strange creatures, rabbit-coloured, except that many are bright red about the middle, and they repel and yet are even attacked by a devil in the shape of a little white ball, which leads them on through toothed briars, sharp furzes, pricking goss and thorns, cursing the thing, weeping even, and anon laughing at their foolish rambling, muttering, heeding no one to the right or left of their career. Demented creatures, as though these balls were their souls that they ever sought to lose and ever repented losing. And silent ever at the heel of each is a familiar spirit, an eerie human hedgehog, all set about with walking sticks, a thing like a cylindrical umbrella stand with a hat and boots and a certain suggestion of leg. And so they pass and are gone, Rising, the amateur nature lover finds he has been reclining on a puffball. These puffballs are certainly the most remarkable example of adaptation to circumstances known to English botanists. They grow abundantly on golf grounds and are exactly like golf balls in external appearance. They are, however, Pharisees and whited sepulchres, and within they are full of a soft mess of a most unpleasant appearance. The amateur nature lover has some on him now, which stuff contains the spores. It is a case of what naturalists call mimicry, one of nature's countless adaptations. The golf player smites these things with force, covering himself with ridicule and spores, and so disseminating this far-sighted and ingenious fungus far and wide about the links. The amateur nature lover passes off the down and towards Banstead village. He is on the watch for characteristic objects of the countryside, and rustling through the leaves beneath a chestnut avenue, he comes upon an old boot. It is a very, very old boot, all its blacking washed off by the rain, and two spreading chestnut leaves, yellow they are with blotches of green, with their broad fingers extended, rest upon it, as if they would protect and altogether cover the poor old boot in its last resting place. It is as if Mother Nature, who lost sight of her product at the tanner's yard, meant to claim her own trampled child again at last after all its wanderings. So we go on, noting a sardine tin gleaming brightly in the amber sunlight through a hazel hedge, and presently another old boot. Some hawthorn berries, some hoary clematis we notice, and then another old boot. Altogether, it may be remarked, in this walk the amateur nature lover saw 11 old boots, most of them dropped in the very sweetest bits of hedge tangle and grassy corner about Banstead. It is natural to ask, whence come all these old boots? They are, as everyone knows, among the commonest objects in a country walk. So common, indeed, that the professional nature lover says very little about them. They cannot grow there, they cannot be dropped from above, they are distinctly earth-worn boots. I have inquired of my own domestic people, and caused inquiry to be made in a large number of households, and there does not appear to be any regular custom of taking boots away to remote and picturesque spots to abandon them. Some discarded boots of my own were produced, but they were quite different from the old boot of the outer air. These home-kept old boots were lovely in their way, hoary with mould running into the most exquisite tints of glaucophane and blue-grey. But it was a different way altogether from that of the wild boot. A friend says that these boots are cast away by tramps. People, he states, give your old tramps boots and hats in great profusion, and the modesty of the recipient drives him to these picturesque and secluded spots to effect the necessary change. But no nature lover has ever observed the tramp or tramp's family in the act of changing their clothes, and since there are even reasons to suppose that their garments are not detachable, it seems preferable to leave the wayside boot as a pleasant flavouring of mystery to our ramble. Another point, which also goes to explode this tramp theory, is that these countryside boots never occur in pairs, as any observer of natural history can testify. So our Cockney Jeffreys proceeds, presently coming upon a cinder path. They use cinders a lot about Sutton to make country paths with. It gives you an unexpected surprise the first time it occurs. You drop suddenly out of a sweetly tangled lane into a veritable bit of the black country, and go on with loathing in your soul for your fellow creatures. There is also an abundance of that last product of civilization, barbed wire. Oh, that I were Gideon! With thorns and briars of the wilderness would I teach these elders of Sutton. But a truce to dark thoughts. We take our last look at the country from the open down above Sutton. Blue hills beyond blue hills recede into the remote distance. From Barnstead Down one can see into Oxfordshire. Windsor Castle is in minute blue silhouette to the left, and to the right and nearer is the Crystal Palace. And closer clusters red-roofed Sutton and its tower. Then Cheam, with its white spire, and further is Ewell, set in a variegated texture of autumn foliage. Water gleams a silver thread at Ewell, and the sinking sun behind us catches a window here and there and turns it into an eye of flame. And so to Sutton Station, and home to Cockneydom once more. From an observatory. It will be some time yet before the rising of the moon. Looking down from the observatory, one can see the pathways across the park dotted out in yellow lamps, each with a fringe of dim green. And further off, hot and bright, is the tracery of the illuminated streets through which the people go to and fro. Save for an occasional stirring or a passing voice speaking out of the dimness beneath me, the night is very still. Not a cloud is to be seen in the dark midwinter sky to hide one speck of its broad smears of stardust and its shining constellations. As the moon rises, heaven will be flooded with blue light, and one after another the stars will be submerged and lost, until only a solitary shining pinnacle of brightness will here and there remain out of the whole host of them. It is curious to think that, were the moon but a little brighter, and truly the ruler of the night, rising to its empire with the setting of the sun, we should never dream of the great stellar universe in which our little solar system swims, or know it only as a traveller's tale, a strange thing to be seen at times in the Arctic Circle. Nay, if the earth's atmosphere were some few score miles higher, a night-long twilight would be dawn like an impenetrable veil across the stars. By a mere accident of our existence, we see their multitude ever and again, when the curtains of the daylight and moonlight, and of our own narrow pressing necessities, are for a little while drawn back. Then, for an interval, we look, as if out of a window, into the great deep of heaven. So far as physical science goes, there is nothing in the essential conditions of our existence to necessitate that we should have these transitory glimpses of infinite space. We can imagine men just like ourselves without such an outlook, but it happens that we have it. If we had not this vision, if we had always so much light in the sky that we could not perceive the stars, our lives, so far as we can infer, would be very much as they are now. There would be still the same needs and desires, the same appliances for our safety and satisfaction. This little gaslit world below would scarcely miss the stars now, if they were blotted out forever. But our science would be different in some respects had we never seen them. We should still have good reason, in Foucault's pendulum experiment, for supposing that the world rotated upon its axis, and that the sun was so far relatively fixed. But we should have no suspicion of the orbital revolution of the world. Instead, we should ascribe the seasonal differences to a meridional movement of the sun. Our spectroscopic astronomy, so far as it refers to the composition of the sun and moon, would stand precisely where it does, but the bulk of our mathematical astronomy would not exist. Our calendar would still be in all essential respects as it is now, our year with the solstices and equinoxes as its cardinal points. The texture of our poetry might conceivably be the poorer without its star-spangles, our philosophy for the want of nebular hypotheses. These would be the main differences. Yet to those who indulge in speculative dreaming, how much smaller life would be with a sun and a moon and a blue beyond for the only visible, only thinkable universe. And it is, we repeat, from the scientific standpoint, a mere accident that the present, the daylight world, periodically opens, as it were, and gives us this inspiring glimpse of the remoteness of space. One may imagine countless meteors and comets streaming through the solar system, unobserved by those who dwelt under such conditions have just been suggested, or some huge dark body from the outer depths sweeping straight at that little visible universe, and all unsuspected by the inhabitants. One may imagine the scientific people of such a world, calm in their assurance of the permanence of things, incapable almost of conceiving any disturbing cause. One may imagine how an imaginative writer who doubted that permanence would be pooh-poohed. "Cannot we see to the utmost limits of space?" they might argue. "And is it not altogether blue and void?" Then, as the unseen visitor draws near, begin the most extraordinary perturbations. The two known heavenly bodies suddenly fail from their accustomed routine. The moon, hitherto invariably full, changes towards its last quarter, and then, behold, for the first time, the rays of the greater stars visibly pierce the blue canopy of the sky. How suddenly, painfully almost, the minds of thinking men would be enlarged when this rash of the stars appeared. And what then if our heavens were to open? Very thin indeed is the curtain between us and the unknown. There is a fear of the night that is begotten of ignorance and superstition, a nightmare fear, the fear of the impossible. And there is another fear of the night, of the starlit night, that comes with knowledge when we see in its true proportion this little life of ours with all its phantasmal environment of cities and stores and arsenals and the habits, prejudices and promises of men. Down there, in the gaslit street, such things are real and solid enough. The only real things, perhaps. But not up here, not under the midnight sky. Here for a space standing silently upon the dim grey tower of the old observatory, we may clear our minds of instincts and illusions and look out upon the real. And now to the eastward. The stars are no longer innumerable, and the sky grows wan. Then a faint silvery mist appears above the housetops, and at last, in the midst of this, there comes a brilliantly shining line, the upper edge of the rising moon. The Mode in Monuments. Stray Thoughts in Highgate Cemetery. On a sharp sunlight morning, when the white clouds are drifting swiftly across the luminous blue sky, there is no finer walk about London than the Highgate Ridge. One may stay a while on the archway looking down upon the innumerable roofs of London, stretching southward into the haze and shining here and there with the reflection of the rising sun, and then wander on along the picturesque road by the College of Church, and so through the Waterloo Park to the cemetery. The Waterloo Park is a pleasant place, full of children and aged persons in perambulators during the middle hours of the day, and in the summer evening time a haunt of young lovers. But your early wanderer finds it solitary, save for Vertumnus, who, with LCC on the front of him, is putting in crocuses. So we wander down to the little red lodge, whence a sinuous road runs to Hampstead, and presently into the close groves of monuments that whiten the opposite slope. How tightly these white sepulchres are packed here! How different this congestion of sorrow from the mossy latitude of God's acre in the country! The dead are crammed together as closely as the living seemed in that bird's-eye view from the archway. There is no ample shadow of trees, no tangled corners where Mother Earth may weave flower garlands over her returning children. The monuments positively jostle and elbow each other for frontage upon the footways, and they are so rawly clean and assertive. Most of them are conspicuously new-whitened, with freshly blackened or new-gilt inscriptions, bare of lichen, moss, or mystery, and altogether so restless that it seems to the meditative man that the struggle for existence, for mere standing room and a show in the world, still rages among the dead. The unstable slope of the hill, with its bristling array of obelisks, crosses, and urns craning one above another, is as directly opposed to the restfulness of the village churchyard, with its serene outspreading yews, as midday Fleet Street to a Sabbath evening amidst the Sussex hills. This cemetery is, indeed, a veritable tumult of tombs. Another thing that presently comes painfully home to one is the lack of individuality among all these dead. Not a necessary lack of individuality so much as a deliberate avoidance of it. As one wanders along the steep, narrow pathways, one is more and more profoundly impressed by the wholesale flavour of the morning, the stereotyping of the monuments. The place is too modern for memento mori and the hourglass and the skull. Instead, slap and dash, that excellent firm of monumental masons everywhere crave to be remembered. Truly, the firm of Slap and Dash have much to answer for among these graves, and they do not seem to be ashamed of it. From one elevated point in this cemetery, one can count more than 100 urns, getting at last weary and confused with the receding multitude. The urn is not dissimilar to the domestic mantle ornament, and Always a stony piece of textile fabric is feigned to be thrown over its shoulder. At times it is wreathed in stony flowers. The only variety is in the form. Sometimes your urn is broad and squat, a Silenus among urns, sometimes fragile and high-shouldered, like a slender old maid. Here an outsize in urn stalwart and strong, and there a dwarf peeping quaintly from its wrapping. The obelisks, too, run through a long scale of size and refinement, but the curious man finds no hidden connection between the carriage of the monument and the character of the dead. Messrs. Slap and Dash apparently take the urn or obelisk that comes readiest to hand. One wonders dimly why mourners have this overwhelming proclivity for Messrs. Slap and Dash and their obelisk and urn. The reason why the firm produces these articles may be guessed at. They are probably easy to make and require scarcely any skill. The contemplative man has a dim vision of a grimy shed in a back street, where a human being passes dismally through life the while he chips out an unending succession of these cheap urns and obelisks for his employer's retailing. But the question why numberless people will profane the memory of their departed by these public advertisements of Slap and Dash and their evil trade is a more difficult problem. For surely nothing could be more unmeaning or more ungainly than the monumental urn, unless it be the monumental obelisk. The plain cross, by contrast, has the tenderest meaning, and is a simple and fitting monument that no repetition can stale. The artistic cowardice of the English is perhaps the clue to the mystery. Your Englishman is always afraid to commit himself to criticism without the refuge of a tu quoque. He is covered dead, just as he is covered living, with the correct thing. A respectable stock in trade is proffered him by the insinuating shopman to whom it is our custom to go. He is told this is selling well, or that it is much admired. Heaven defend that he should admire on his own account. He orders the stock urn or the stock slab because it is large and sufficiently expensive for his means and sorrow, and because he knows nothing better. So we mourn as the stonemason decrees, or after the example and pattern of the smiths next door. But some day it will dawn upon us that a little thought and a search after beauty are far more becoming than an order and a cheque to the nearest advertising tradesman. Or it may be we shall conclude that the anonymous piece of a grassy mould is better than his commercial brutalities, and so there will be an end of him. One may go from end to end of this cemetery and find scarcely anything beautiful, appropriate, or tender. A lion, ill done, and yet to some degree impressive, lies complacently above a menagerie keeper, and near this is a tomb of some imagination, with reliefs of the life of Christ. In one place, a grotesque horse, with a head disproportionately vast, is to be seen. Perhaps among all these monuments, the one to Mrs. Blake is the most pleasing. It is a simple and quaintly executed kneeling figure, with a certain quiet and pathetic reverence of pose that is strangely restful against the serried vulgarity around it. But the tradesman will not leave us. He follows us up and down, indecently clamouring his name and address, and at last turns our meditation to despair. Certain stock devices become as painful as popular autotypes. There is the lily broken on its stalk. We meet it here on a cross, and there on an obelisk, presently on the pedestal of an urn. There is the hand pointing upward, here balanced on the top of an obelisk, and there upon a cross. The white-robed angel, free from the remotest shadow of expression, meets us again and again. "All this is mine," says the tradesman's ghoul. "Behold the names of me. Slap and dash here, the ugliness company there, and this the work of the cheap and elegant funeral association. This is where we slew the art of sculpture. These are our trophies that sculpture is no more. All this marble might have been beautiful. All this sorrow might have been expressive had it not been for us. See, this our border, number A5, and our pedestal, number E, and our second quality urn, along of a nice appropriate text, a pretty combination, and a cheap one. Or we can do it you better in border A3 and pedestal C, and a larger urn or a hangle." The meditative man is seized with a dismal horror and retreats to the gates. Even there, a wooden advertisement grins broadly at him in his discomfiture, and shouts a name athwart his route. And so down the winding road to the valley, and then up Parliament Hill towards Hampstead and its breeze-whipped ponds. And the mind of him is full of a dim vision of days that have been, when sculptor and stonemason were one, when the artist put his work in the porch for all the world to see, when people had leisure to think how things should be done, and heart to do them well, when there was beauty in the business of life and dignity in death. And he wonders, rather hopelessly, if people will ever rise up against these damnable tradesmen who ruin our arts, make our lives costly and dismal, and advertise, even on our graves. How I Died. It is now 10 years ago since I received my death warrant. All these 10 years I have been, and I am, and shall be, I hope, for years yet, a doomed man. It only occurred to me yesterday that I have been missing rather than dodging, the common enemy for such a space of time. Then I know I respected him. It seemed he marched upon me inexorably, irresistible. Even at last I felt his grip upon me. I bowed in the shadow, and he passed. 10 years ago, and once since, he and I have been very near. But now he seems to be but a blind man, and we, with all our solemn folly of medicine and hygiene, but players in a game of blind man's buff. The gaunt, familiar hand comes out suddenly, swiftly, this time, surely, and it passes close to my shoulder. I hear someone near me cry, and it is over. Another ream of paper. There is time at least for the great book still. Very close to the tragedy of life is the comedy, brightest upon the very edge of the dark, And I remember now, with a queer touch of sympathetic amusement, my dear departed self of the middle 80s. How the thing staggered me. I was full of the vast ambition of youth. I was still at the age when death is quite out of sight, when life is still an interminable vista of years, and then suddenly, with a gout of blood upon my knuckle, with a queer, familiar taste in my mouth, that cough, which had been a bother, became a tragedy, and this world that had been so solid grew faint and thin. I saw through it, saw his face near to my own, suddenly found him beside me, when I had been dreaming he was far beyond there, far away over the hills. My first phase was an immense sorrow for myself. It was a purely selfish emotion. You see, I had been saving myself up, denying myself half the pride of life and most of its indulgence, drilling myself like a drill sergeant with my eyes on those now unattainable hills. Had I known it was to end so soon, I should have planned everything so differently. I lay in bed mourning my truncated existence. And presently the sorrow broadened. They were so sorry, so genuinely sorry for me, and they considered me so much now. I had this and that they would never have given me before. The stateliest bedding, the costliest food. I could feel from my bed the suddenly disorganized house, the distressed friends, the new-born solicitude. Insensibly, a realization of enhanced importance came to temper my regrets for my neglected sins. The lost world that had seemed so brilliant and attractive dwindled steadily as the days of my illness wore on. I thought more of the world's loss and less of my own. Then came the long journey, the princely style of it, the sudden awakening on the part of external humanity, which had hitherto been wont to jostle me, to help itself before me, to turn its back upon me, to my importance. He had a diseased lung, cannot live long. I was going into the dark, and I was not afraid with ostentation. I still regarded that, though now with scarcely so much gravity as heretofore, as a very magnificent period in my life. For nearly 4 months I was dying with immense dignity. Plutarch might have recorded it. I wrote, in touchingly unsteady pencil, to all my intimate friends, and indeed to many other people. I saw the littleness of hate and ambition. I forgave my enemies, and they were subdued and owned to it. How they must regret these admissions. I made many memorable remarks. This lasted, I say, nearly 4 months. The medical profession, which had pronounced my death sentence, reiterated it steadily, has indeed done so now this 10 years. Towards the end of those 4 months, however, dying lost its freshness for me. I began to detect a certain habitual quality in my service. I had exhausted all my memorable remarks upon the subject, and the strain began to tell upon all of us. One day, in the springtime, I crawled out alone, carefully wrapped and with a stick, to look once more, perhaps for the last time, on sky and earth, and the first scattered skirmishers of the coming army of flowers. It was a day of soft wind, when the shadows of the cloud go sweeping over the hills. Quite casually, I happened upon a girl clambering over a hedge, and her dress had caught in a bramble, and the chat was quite impromptu and most idyllic. I remember she had 3 or 4 wood anemones in her hand. Wind stars, she called them, and I thought it a pretty name. And we talked of this and that, with a light in our eyes, as young folks will. I quite forgot I was a doomed man. I surprised myself walking home with a confident stride that jarred with the sudden recollection of my funereal circumstances. For a moment I tried in vain to think what it was had slipped my memory. Then it came, colourless and remote. "Oh, Death, he's a bore," I said. "I've done with him," and laughed to think of having done with him. "And why not so?" said I. The end.